Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why does the National Party hate the forestry sector?
I don't know.
Why do they hate forestry so much? This is the one sector that got them out of a hole in the first commitment period of Kyoto was forestry. This was the sector that put us in the black. Why does the National Party continue this sustained attack on the forestry sector? Because when I picked up this bill and saw the brief description of it, I thought, OK, well, that looks fairly reasonable, until I read it. And until I read the regulatory impact statement and realised this is not about what the Minister was talking about at all. This is not an unintended consequence of the emissions trading scheme. This is the very deliberate result of a government that has failed to restrict the cheap international units that have flooded into this country and collapsed the carbon price. This is only a problem, this arbitrage issue, because there is such a differential between the New Zealand unit price and the cheap Kyoto unit prices, which the national government have done nothing about and continue to do nothing about. That's the problem. Fix that and this all goes away. And I will put up an SOP in committee stage in my name to do just that, to fix the actual problem instead of just taking another whack at the forestry industry. I mean, I really don't understand why the National Party hate forestry as much as they do, given the benefits to this country. Well, the good news is a Labor government is coming that has a plan for the forestry sector that includes restricting these cheap international units and assisting this export industry, which has huge job potential. Because what the Minister would have us believe is that this is purely about re-registration. So in a mandatory emission reporting period of 5 years, a forester can go in, collect NZUs and then deregister from the scheme and pay that liability with these cheap Kyoto units. They can then the next day re-register to enter the scheme, get NZUs and deregister. So, yeah, I mean, that's not, we don't want that to happen, but that is a symptom of the current failure of this government to have an adequate price on carbon and to reduce that gap in price differential between NZUs and foreign units. That's the actual problem. So what they're saying now, though, is that actually they're not just going to stop the re-registration, because you could just do that by saying that a forester can only register once in any reporting period. Fixes the problem goes away. What they've chosen to do is say, actually, if you're in forestry, you don't have any access to these Kyoto units at all. So even if you're deregistering with no intention to re-register, even if you're deregistering because the economics aren't working or for whatever genuine reason, you don't get access to those units, whereas everyone else in the scheme does. So this isn't about re-registration at all, because if it was, we could simply fix that problem by saying you can't re-register. This is about whacking forestry once again. And when you look at the regulatory impact statement on this bill, they make it quite clear that actually this isn't about re-registration at all. And one of the points that they make is that it will be seen as unfair to post-1989 forest land participants because it imposes a restriction on their use of Kyoto units, whereas other sectors continue to have unrestricted use. Well, let's talk about those other sectors, because there is one sector that is full of National Party mates who got free allocation of NZUs, and that's the heavy industrial emitters. So the Rio Tinto. Remember the $80 million they gave Rio Tinto? Well, Rio Tinto also got a free allocation of NZUs, and Labor supports that, absolutely. They can engage in arbitrage by taking those NZUs and paying their liability, their pollution liability with these cheap international units. Are the government stopping that? No. No, why? Because the government like those guys, those are their mates, but they don't like forestry. So they're going to allow arbitrage to continue amongst the heavy industrial emitters who got free NZU allocations. They can continue to engage in arbitrage, but forestry can't. Forestry can't. And one of the reasons they talk about is fiscal risk. So they say, we need to do this because the fiscal risk to the Crown is so great. Well, if we take the Climate Change Response Act 2012 report from the EPA, and if we use the methodology they use for their calculations, what we find is that in the year to June 2013, there were 36 million NZUs allocated to industry, to their mates, which at today's prices represent $111 million in value. Now, of that 36 million, only 24,000 were surrendered by that group to meet their obligations, so practically nothing at all. The balance were met through these cheap Kyoto units that we're now telling forestry they can't have access to. So if we use the same logic as is used in the EPA's own report, what we find is that the fiscal risk to the Crown from the heavy industrial emitters arbitrage is $107 million. $107 million in fiscal risk. So what is the fiscal risk that we are dealing with in this bill caused by the post-1989 foresters? $11 to $66 million. $11 to $66 million in fiscal risk from forestry, $107 million in fiscal risk from heavy industrial emitters. Now, which is the group we're targeting in this legislation? Forestry. Why? Because they hate forestry. Why are we not targeting heavy industrial emitters? Because those are their mates.
That's right.
Those are their mates. So if this was about fiscal risk, then actually we would be applying this across the board, and we would have actually no issue with that, with it being applied across the board with the same rules applying to everyone, not one rule for National's mates and another rule for the forestry sector, which was the only sector doing the heavy lifting in the first commitment period of Kyoto in terms of emissions reductions. The government's allowed the carbon price to collapse. There are practically no complementary measures going on at all. An analysis of the government's own figures show that by 2030, if we compare doing absolutely nothing at all in terms of climate change policy to the government's current plan on climate change policy, what's the difference in emissions reductions? 0.4%. 0.4%. We effectively have business as usual when it comes to climate change policy under this government. So when I hear Minister Simon Bridges talking about needing to uphold the reputation of our emissions trading scheme, are you kidding me? Are you seriously kidding me? That thing lost its reputation the minute this government was elected and completely gutted it and allowed the carbon price to collapse overnight. Our emissions trading scheme hasn't had a good reputation since this government was elected. It's nothing more than a fig leaf. So I'm sorry, the biggest risk to our reputation in terms of climate change is this national government, Simon Bridges, Tim Grosser, John Key. Oh, and Jerry Brownlee, who's a climate change denier, who just wants to build more of his carbon sequestering motorways. So when I hear the government talking about reputational risk to the ETS, I'm sorry, but that is just galling. So the other angle on this, of course, is that there are people who are currently going through the process of deregistering and re-registering who are going to be caught out by this. And an email went out today to ministers because, of course, there was no consultation on this bill. No one knew this was coming. And it was saying, we have no problem with the direction of what we understand the legislation is trying to achieve, but currently we have 25 clients who have sold some or all of their NZUs to purchase ERUs. They've purchased these ERUs to surrender, as the legislation allows, once we had completed and submitted the deregistration applications to MPI. We can complete these submissions by the end of next week, but do not want to progress at the moment if we do. As I understand, our clients will be required to surrender NZUs that they no longer hold. These are mum and dad type forest owners, and although the amounts involved may seem small to you, they are substantial to them. So don't fool yourselves, National Government, that this isn't going to have a very real impact on people today. And what makes that even worse is that here I have the Sustainable Forestry Bulletin from the Ministry of Primary Industries. And what this does, this is from August 2013, January 2014, February 2014, telling people how to deregister and re-register their forests. So the Ministry for Primary Industries has been providing guidelines and advice to post-1989 foresters on how to do this. They may be forgiven for thinking that the government was okay with it, and I think they can be forgiven for being extremely surprised that the government has now pulled the rug out from under them when the Sustainable Forestry Bulletin from August 2013 says things to consider when removing and re-registering post-1989 forests in the ETS. So the government has been promoting this as a legitimate tool for foresters to use. They have given absolutely no warning that this was going to happen. They have allowed price gouging to continue under the ETS by fuel and energy companies who are buying these cheap international units, 35 cents, and then charging through power bills and at the petrol pump around $20 a tonne. Now, they have no problem with that. That's okay. As I said, they have no problem with heavy emitters being able to engage in arbitrage. That's okay, because those are their mates. But when it comes to forestry, the one sector that has been doing the heavy lifting for them in terms of our net emissions, the one sector that's done this, they are whacking them once again. They did it the first time by allowing the carbon price to collapse. They've continued to oppose Labour's attempts to restrict these cheap international units, and now that they are doing some restrictions, it's only impacting on foresters.
Time has expired. Oh, Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill before us is a composite one.